Hi, I'm Father Joseph Mary, and welcome back to A Simple Word, where we reflect on the gospel for the coming Sunday. The worst news Deborah Mann ever received was that her 3-year-old son David had been diagnosed with leukemia. Deborah took David to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston to see Dr. John Truman, who specialized in treating children with cancer. Dr. Truman's prognosis was devastating. David had a 50-50 chance of survival. So for nearly a year, Deborah endured countless clinic visits, watching helplessly as her son received blood tests, intravenous drugs, and painful treatments. Her suffering was in some ways worse than David's, because she had to stand by, weeping with fear and grief, yearning to take that pain on herself, but unable to do anything but clutch her little boy's hands with loving assurance. When he turned 4, David had to have a spinal tap, an extremely painful procedure for anyone. It was unbearable for Deborah to watch. It took 3 nurses to hold David still while he screamed and struggled and sobbed. It seemed at times to Deborah that the cure was worse than the sickness, and all she could do was stand by and watch. And she thought, if only I could trade places with him. If only I could die so that he could live. This Sunday we celebrate the feast of the presentation of the Lord. And Luke's gospel finds Joseph and Mary taking their infant son to the great temple in Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. This is a summary that really involved 3 ancient Jewish ceremonies. First was the circumcision. Every Jewish male was to be circumcised on the 8th day following his birth. This ceremony was so sacred to the Jews that it could be carried out even on the Sabbath, when nearly all other such acts were forbidden. Circumcision was the mark of the covenant between God and Abraham, and it denoted that this child belonged to the people of God. It was also at this time that a boy received his name. The second ceremony was the redemption of the firstborn. The law stated that every firstborn male was sacred to God, that they literally belonged to God. Now, this likely hearkened to Abraham's intended sacrifice of Isaac, in which a ram was substituted in his place, and to the Passover in Egypt, in which the firstborn were ransomed by the blood of a lamb. But by the time of Jesus, the law stated that for 5 shekels, the child could be ransomed back from sacrifice. Finally, the third ceremony was the purification after childbirth. When a Jewish woman gave birth to a male child, she was considered unclean for 40 days. Meaning she couldn't enter the temple or participate in religious ceremonies. After the 40 days, she had to bring a lamb and a young pigeon to the temple to offer sacrifice. Now, for the average Jewish family, that was an expensive purchase. So the law allowed that in place of a lamb, a poor family could offer 2 young pigeons instead. This was called the offering of the poor, and it was the offering which Mary brought. Now, these ceremonies might seem strange to modern ears, but at the heart of all of them was the certain conviction that a child was a gift from God. A child was sacred. Now we know why Joseph and Mary have made the 10-mile pilgrimage to Jerusalem with their infant son. They were a poor family, but a devout family, and God was in the first place in their lives. But something quite unexpected happens as they're fulfilling their religious duties. They enter Jerusalem by the fountain gate near the city's southern edge. They pass by the pool of Siloam, where the sick and the disabled are bathing in the waters. They approach the Temple Mount. They make their purchase of 2 young pigeons, and they pass through the gate. They make their way across the bustling court of the Gentiles toward the eastern gate. All around them, the heads of men are bowed in prayer. And suddenly an elderly man approaches. His name is Simeon. Simeon's a man of profound prayer who rarely leaves the temple. His days and nights are devoted to God, seeking God, praising God, listening to God. Like Joseph and Mary, God's in the first place in this man's life. And so consumed is Simeon by a life of prayer that he becomes incredibly attuned to the presence and the prodding of the Holy Spirit. He's a true contemplative in every sense of the word. And in prayer, the Spirit had assured him he would not die until he had seen the Christ, the Messiah of God. And suddenly, as he sees this young family approaching, as he sees this young girl clasping her infant son, the Spirit bursts forth within him in delight, like an overflowing fountain of joy. This is the infant. This is the Christ of God. And he could hardly contain himself. Prayer burst forth audibly. Lord, you may let your servant die in peace. My eyes have seen your salvation. But just as suddenly, the Spirit shows him something else. Some portent of the child's future. And his face is suddenly grave, but his eyes full of compassion as he turns to the child's mother. This child, your son, is destined to cause the rise and fall of many in Israel. He will be a sign that's contradicted, resisted, opposed, and you yourself a sword shall pierce. In Greek, literally, you yourself, aromphia, shall pierce. Aromphia was a curved single-edged blade attached to a pole, literally a lance. The lance that will pierce your son's heart on Golgotha will pierce your soul with unspeakable grief. At the Annunciation, God had asked for Mary's consent. And without knowing what lay ahead, Mary had pledged her faith. I'm the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done to me according to your word. The full meaning of that vow had become more clear. Her son would suffer unimaginable pain. And because of this, she, his mother, would suffer unimaginable grief. What Jesus suffered in his body, Mary suffered in her soul. But at that moment, standing before Simeon, clinging to her infant son, she couldn't imagine fully what lay ahead. In the face of her fear and her dread, she could only repeat, I'm the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done to me according to your word. No matter what suffering lay before her, Mary vowed again to love God and to love her son. There's a profound message in this gospel for our lives. Because at the start of any commitment, whether it be priesthood or marriage or religious life, whether it be the welcoming of a new child or the beginning of a new job, we never see fully what's going to be asked of us. St. Faustina once wrote that if the Lord had shown her beforehand all that she would have to suffer in religious life, she would never have had the courage to begin. The same is true for us. We encounter crosses and suffering and agonies that we could never have imagined or foreseen. Whether it be the loss of a spouse or the suffering of a child or the shattering pain of broken promises and rejection. Sometimes all we can do is stand by like Deborah, watching and waiting and weeping. But in every such moment, we should repeat the silent prayer of Mary. Father, I'm your servant. Be it done unto me according to your word. Because in the darkest of moments, that's when love's tested. But it's also in the darkest of moments that love truly grows. I'm Father Joseph Mary, and thanks for listening to A Simple Word. If you like, be sure to share, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.